David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
After threatening to veto it, after slamming Democrats, after saying that we must have full funding for that wall with Mexico that I thought Mexico was going to pay for anyway, but I guess we're forgetting about that. After saying that it must contain a deal to deal with DACA, Donald Trump has signed this just massive $1.3 trillion spending bill that has a huge number of conservatives furious with him. But weirdly, he also vowed never to sign a similar bill again. Very hard to figure out what happened. Let's take a look at what Donald Trump had to say at this signing ceremony for the $1.3 trillion omnibus spending package. Trump said, quote, "There are a lot of things that I'm unhappy about in this bill. There are a lot of things that we shouldn't have had in this bill, but we were in a sense forced. If we want to build our military, we were forced to have. There are some things that we should have in the bill, but I say to Congress that I will never sign another bill like this again. I'm not going to do it again. Nobody read it. It's only hours old." Now, the only hours old and nobody read it thing only seems to be a problem, I guess, when Republicans don't like the bill or some aspects of it, and Trump wants to, I guess, criticize something. Also, the idea here of I did it this time, but this is definitely the last time. It's sort of like the way a parent would try to scold their kid that just took a cookie again, and this is the last time that the parent is going to go along with it type of thing. It's just this completely black and white sort of framing that Donald Trump loves to put out there, while at the same time trying to maintain sort of some connection to everybody on the political spectrum. It's terrible. Democrats are terrible. I almost vetoed it. I thought about vetoing it, Republicans, so you should like me for that, but I'm going to sign it. But this is the last time, so you don't have to be too mad with me about the fact that I did sign it. Doesn't really project strength, doesn't really project consistency in any way. And notable conservatives spanning the gamut, right? From conspiracy theorists on the right to alt-rightists to more traditional ideological conservatives, just furious with Donald Trump over this, the base arguably in a sort of pseudo revolt. We'll start with Laura Ingraham, a Fox News host, long-term conservative radio host. She tweeted when Donald Trump signed this bill, missed opportunity by Donald Trump by signing this spending bill. If he loses the House, Dems will go straight to impeachment. Then we have alt-right extremist and occasional attacker of this program, Mike Cernovich, who tweeted, "Congratulations to my liberal friends. You're getting Congress back. I hope your party does more for you than Donald Trump has done for his supporters." Conspiracy theorist Paul Joseph Watson of Alex Jones' InfoWars fame getting in on the action, quoting an article from InfoWars, "This is the day that the swamp won. Trump base revolts over signing of budget bill." And then we have uber conservative Ann Coulter, who was on a tirade last week. "I will never sign another bill like this again," quoting Donald Trump. "Yeah, because you'll be impeached." And another one from Ann Coulter as this was going on, "It's 3D chess," in parentheses, "there's never going to be a wall." And to add to the anger over Trump signing this just massive spending bill, he has also angered the pro-gun right. Within hours of signing this bill, which a lot of right-wingers were furious with him for doing, Donald Trump put out a tweet about bump stocks and firearms, which has also made a lot of his supporters furious, saying, quote, "Obama administration legalized bump stocks. Bad idea. As I promised, today the Department of Justice will issue the rule banning bump stocks with a mandated comment period. We will ban all devices that turn legal weapons into illegal machine guns." I hate to admit this, but there's this totally toxic subreddit on Reddit called the_Donald, and it's become kind of a de facto epicenter for the committed Trumpists. And you should have seen what was going on over there as Donald Trump was saying we're banning bump stocks and I'm signing this massive bill, which, by the way, has very little funding for that wall. Just immediately when Trump signed the bill and tweeted about the bump stock thing, people on the Donald, which is considered like the most committed community of Trumpists in the United States, posting messages rather, that they're furious with Trump, that this is just a disaster. Trump has betrayed them. It's all terrible. And that type of dissent is just not allowed on the Donald. That is not looked kindly upon. And moderators starting to ban users by the dozens on the Donald subreddit. And they even had a stickied message at the top of the subreddit saying something along the lines of, I'm paraphrasing here, but instead of being mad at Trump, be mad at the senators and the members of Congress who created the bill, rather than just being mad at Trump for signing it, because ultimately that's the bill he was presented with and it's not really his fault, which is just a classic type of response when you have someone who runs on populist rhetoric, but they're actually an authoritarian, right? The authoritarian populist rhetoric, but they are actually authoritarians in office. They do whatever the hell they want in office. People start blaming others because of the cognitive dissonance. In this case, they said, hey, don't blame Trump. Blame the House and Senate who put together this bill. So the part I want to sort of dig into here is there are people who will hear me talking about what Trump did and how the right is angry. And they'll say, well, David, it sounds like Trump did things you like. He signed this spending bill and he said he's banning bump stocks. So why don't you like Trump? Why don't you defend Trump? This isn't as simple as, it's the right analogy, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? It's not that type of thing. We're talking about a belligerent and incompetent danger, like a systemic, fundamental danger to the country and the world. The left isn't just going to come to the guy's side because he manages every once in a while not to do the worst possible thing or says something just minutely sensible, right? This is someone with no actual underlying political philosophy who is going to legislate in a way that is completely haphazard and unpredictable. When you combine the total lack of knowledge about politics with what's really his primary desire, which is he wants to be liked and he wants to be able to check off boxes that can at least be touted as accomplishments, this is the kind of garbage you get, right? The left has known it for a long time. Maybe the right now kind of starting to realize that when you see the outsider as a positive thing, there's ways in which the outsider idea can completely backfire on you as well, which is he ends up signing a $1.3 trillion spending bill that you don't really like and says, hey, I think we're going to ban bump stocks. And it is not surprising in the least. And the only question now is whether the Trumpists say, hey, you know what? He has abandoned us. And by the way, I've been saying for more than a year that they've been completely bamboozled by Trump. They say, he's abandoned us, so we're going to abandon him. That's one possibility. I actually don't see that as the most likely possibility. I think the more likely possibility is they sort of reinvigorate themselves with the idea that, hey, Hillary could have been president, right? We don't have Hillary. We've got Trump. He's an outsider. He's a political novice. He's going to do some things that we don't like, but let's stick with him for the long term here. Let's keep this going to the extent that we can and prevent Democrats from taking over in 2018. And I think ultimately, once they are presented with the option, Democrats may be winning anything in the midterms, in 2020, whatever, and just continuing to support Trump, they're going to go with Trump. And part of the evidence for that are those results that I told you about from Illinois' 3rd Congressional District last week, where 20,000 Republicans voted for the unopposed Nazi Holocaust denier. We'll see ultimately how many Republicans in that district will choose in November the Republican Nazi Holocaust denier over voting for a Democrat. But I think in the long term, what you're going to see is that the truly committed Trumpist is going to stick with Trump because Democrats are just worse on every level. Send me your thoughts about this. I'm on Twitter at @DPacman. Show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show. We'll be right back.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
I want to say thanks to today's new member of the day, Marlene Saulgruber. Marlene, thank you so much. We're mostly an audience-funded program, whether it's through membership or through Patreon or through people who go and purchase coffee mugs or bumper stickers or T-shirts at davidpakman.com/gear. Our primary source of funding is the audience. So that's why it's so important and why I'm so thankful for really great people like Marlene Saulgruber who have signed up at davidpakman.com/membership. But it's not just our new members that I want to thank. Our long-term sustaining members are also really, really important. And Laura McKean has now been with us for almost 7 years, since 2011, coming up on her 7-year membership anniversary with the show. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Marlene. You can join both Marlene and Laura at davidpakman.com/membership. We've got a coupon code which will save you 40% off of membership. That's Vote Soon 18. And if you want something simpler and quicker than membership, you can make a pledge of as little as a single dollar per month at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. And we are going to have some news upcoming about that initiative as well. Check that out. All right. If we want to think about foreign policy and Trump, if I say to you, what was Donald Trump's most controversial foreign policy position during his campaign? And by controversial, I mean controversial to his own base, right? Given that he's a Republican, trying to convince other Republicans to vote for him, what was Trump's most controversial position on foreign policy? Your first reaction would probably be, wait a second, Trump had foreign policy positions? After you get past that, you would say, all right, my second reaction is, it's the war on Iraq, right? On foreign policy, Trump ardently, stridently said, unequivocally said, that he considered the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the Iraq war that was carried out by President George W. Bush, to have been a total and complete blunder. He slammed George W. Bush countless times over it. He said he never would have gone in. Now, the truth back then was that before and during the Iraq war, Trump did say many times that he supported it or that he would have gone in. He said it on the Howard Stern show during an interview. He said it other times. But that's not what I want to focus on right now. What I want to focus on is that Donald Trump ran on the Iraq war was a total disaster. Donald Trump has now replaced his second national security advisor, H.R. McMaster, with Iraq war architect, cheerleader, and maniac John Bolton. Okay? The big announcement came on, obviously, Twitter, where Donald Trump said, I am pleased to announce that effective April 9th, 2018, Ambassador John Bolton will be my new national security advisor. I'm very thankful for the service of General H.R. McMaster, who has done an outstanding job and will always remain my friend. There will be an official contact handover on April 9th. The he will always remain my friend thing, it sounds kind of like elementary school. I don't want to focus too much on that, but that's weird. We're talking about issues of national security, and ultimately, is the important thing whether the guy will still be your friend after you fire him? I don't think so, but that's not what I want to focus on. What I want to focus on is, if, as Trump claims, he believes that the Iraq war was an unmitigated disaster, why do you bring in one of the biggest advocates of starting that war? And the answer, more than likely, is to start a different war, one that I guess you think will go better than the Iraq war went. Again, if you believe Donald Trump on this, and who better to start wars than John Bolton? I've said before that if I was picking advisors or cabinet members, I never would have hired Rex Tillerson. I never would have hired H.R. McMaster. I never would hire Jim Mattis. But in the context of Trump's inner circle, Tillerson, McMaster, and Mattis are some of the more moderate voices that might direct Trump away from sort of erratic and unhinged military action. Two of those three voices of somewhat reason are now gone, and Bolton is coming in. So the question is, what wars might Trump want to start? What wars might John Bolton be interested in starting? And the top prospects in no particular order are Iran and North Korea. Interestingly, Bolton is also pretty unhinged on Russia. So even in the context of all the Russia stuff that we've been following, it's not even off the table that if Trump really starts to listen to Bolton, and there's every expectation that Bolton will have Trump's ear, that Bolton might start trying to push Trump on Russia. We're already seeing that today with the decision made to expel 60 Russians from the United States based on Russian involvement in that UK poisoning, or presumed believed Russian involvement in that poisoning. That's sort of another story. We'll talk about that on a different day. But the real immediate threat is, what does Trump want to do in Iran? What does Trump want to do in North Korea? And who is left that would try to talk Trump out of it? It's not going to be Stephen Miller. Jim Mattis, I guess, might try, and he could fail if opposed by John Bolton, who Trump really seems to like the idea of having around him. And then the other angle here is generally having someone much more aggressive and less conciliatory on Trump's side in advance of the start of these talks that are believed at some point that will take place with North and South Korea, right? In a couple of months, supposedly, those are going to start. So this is, if you're looking to start wars, this is the guy that you bring in, right? You bring in John Bolton. And the other story here is that since the selection of Bolton itself is pretty insane and disturbing, there's less discussion of this. But we're 14 months in and Trump's already on his third national security advisor, right? One who first national security advisor was indicted. And we're not going to get into that in detail now. We've talked about the chaos in the White House. That's part of this as well. It's just more of that. But Bolton specifically coming in is a real signal to a particular war hawk wing of the Republican Party. And I thought that this was specifically what Trump wasn't going to do, right? All along we were told, hey, you know what? If Hillary gets in, she'll go to war with Syria, or she'll go to war here or there. It's Killary in chief, et cetera, et cetera. And in the end, the moves that Trump is making are to push out the more moderate voices that say, hey, hold on, let's scale back a little bit on North Korea. Let's scale back a little bit on Iran. And you bring in war maniac in chief John Bolton.
During the campaign, it wasn't just that Donald Trump called the Iraq war a blunder.
Yeah.
He also claims that the Bush administration lied to get us into that war.
Sure.
Chief among the liars would have to be John Bolton.
Yeah, right. I mean, certainly, you had Condi Rice, you had Colin Powell, but Bolton, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, one of the architects. But this was one of the main guys. So bringing him is weird. And then as far as the firings and the revolving door goes, it appears as though the VA secretary is also going to be fired soon, but plenty of time to talk about that when it happens. This is one of the more complicated stories where there are lots of little details and it can become kind of difficult to keep it straight, but I want to try because it's a really important story. And the wide angle on this is that we've now learned that the hacker Guccifer 2.0 was a Russian intelligence officer. Now, why do we care about Guccifer 2.0? The reason we care is that Guccifer 2.0 was considered to be the person or maybe a group of people that hack the DNC. That's the hack that led to the infamous leaks that were at the center of endless election controversy, that it seemed as though the Trump campaign had foreknowledge of when they were going to be released as well. So without getting into the really technical stuff that's not really of interest to our audience and not really relevant to most of our audience, what happened is that Guccifer slipped up. Guccifer at 2.0 was portraying themselves as Romanian. That was sort of suspect all along because of the really terrible Romanian that Guccifer 2.0 appeared to speak. And long story short, U.S. investigators have identified Guccifer 2.0 not generally as a Russian intelligence officer, but as a specific GRU officer working out of the GRU headquarters in a particular office in Moscow, Russia. And this happened because normally Guccifer 2.0 would use a VPN, that's a virtual private network, and that hides their actual location. One time, at least one time that we know about, Guccifer did not activate that VPN and left an actual real Moscow IP address in the server logs of an American social media company. Guccifer 2.0, we know, was directly in touch with Trump advisor Roger Stone via Twitter. Stone has admitted this. But the big news here is that this makes it even more difficult for Donald Trump to deny collusion and coordination. It makes it even more difficult to believe that Trump and his associates were not directly involved with someone who we now know to be a Russian intelligence officer. Because for a long time, you had Trump and his administration denying what was the intelligence community consensus, that Russia was behind the DNC hacks. We also know from the public timing of a number of different social media posts and meetings and public statements that there seemed to be some pretty significant awareness, even maybe ahead of time, of when these leaks were going to take place. If the hackers who got those documents are Russian intelligence officers, that is yet another link between Donald Trump and his team's knowledge of these hacks and the Russian individual who did the hacking. But even putting Trump aside for a second here, Roger Stone admitted that he was in touch with someone who we now know to have been a Russian intelligence officer, Guccifer 2.0, who did the hacking. That's sort of like a case closed, end of story. And I can only imagine that this isn't going to go unnoticed by Robert Mueller. And by the way, we've also learned that Robert Mueller is now taken over the investigation of Guccifer 2.0, which puts yet another layer onto this. Mueller can now prove that Roger Stone, who was one of Trump's closest advisors, was in touch not just generally with the vague and amorphous Russians. Stone was in touch with a specific, nameable intelligence operative in Russia. I just hope that before we find out more about this, we don't hear that this intelligence officer has accidentally fallen on a knife 10 times and then subsequently thrown himself out of a window. These accidents happen all the time in Russia. Accidentally ingesting polonium happens all the time to people that could be a liability to the Russian state. I really hope that that doesn't happen here, because this is actually a major story.
Yeah, sometimes people will shoot themselves in the head 4 or 5 times, which I didn't even know you could do.
I didn't know that either. Yeah, or in the back multiple times. It's crazy what people are able to do in Russia when they just coincidentally happen to be in a situation that is dangerous when it comes to the Kremlin's perspective. This also, by the way, starts to paint a more accurate picture of why Sam Nunberg seemed just horrified about the possibility of turning over his communications with Roger Stone to Robert Mueller. How many weeks ago was it that the Nunberg, it was like 3 weeks ago. Yeah. Sam Nunberg went on all sorts of media and started saying he's ignoring a subpoena from Robert Mueller, that he's not going to turn over his communications with Roger Stone. And he seemed a combination of both under the influence of alcohol, which Erin Burnett pointed out during her CNN interview, and just genuinely afraid. And now that we know that Stone was not only in touch generally with Russians, but with Guccifer 2.0, who we now know to be a Russian intelligence officer, I actually get why Nunberg was so afraid, right? If I was Nunberg and I knew what Stone was doing and maybe speculated or had an inkling that Guccifer was a Russian intelligence operative, and Mueller says, give me all your communications that you've had with Roger Stone, I'd probably look as afraid as Nunberg myself and would be drinking before national TV interviews.
Oh, sure. And Sam Nunberg said that he didn't want to betray Roger Stone because he was his longtime mentor.
Right.
I mean, you got to have a better reason than that. You're going to flip pretty quickly, I think, if you're up against Robert Mueller.
I think that we have seen those who we would have presumed loyalty to the Trump apparatus from flip already. And it never rang true from the beginning, and now we're learning more about why. So it's going to be an interesting several weeks, that's for sure. Let's take a break, discuss this and any other stories from today's show on the David Pakman Show subreddit, which you can subscribe to instantly at davidpakman.com/reddit.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm joined today by Greg Kading, who's a retired LAPD homicide detective assigned to solve the homicides of rappers Notorious B.I.G. and Tupac Shakur. He's also author of Murder Rap and the co-executive producer of USA Network's newest crime drama, Unsolved: The Murders of Tupac and the Notorious B.I.G., now a private investigator. Greg, thanks for joining us. You know, when I was growing up, these two murders were two of these sort of notable murders that got a lot of attention from really from culture and society at the time. And you worked on both of these. Talk just a little bit about how you got into working as a homicide detective at LAPD.
So I started out with kind of an investigative emphasis on gangs. And of course, with gangs always goes narcotics. So I had a really strong background in gang and narcotic investigations. And then, of course, those two things are commonly associated with homicides in Los Angeles. A lot of gang shootings, a lot of narcotic-related homicides. And so you just kind of transition from one investigation into another. And as you gain experience and your investigative skill set, you just kind of rise up towards the more important investigations, which are the homicides.
Okay, now when it comes to the Tupac Shakur investigation, talk a little bit about like what was your day to day. I think that a lot of people think they have an idea of sort of what most of your day is like when you're investigating a homicide, but I think maybe people's assumptions are not correct. So like, what do you really spend most of your time doing when you're looking into a homicide like that of Tupac Shakur?
Well, the Tupac and Biggie case, because of course I started out looking into Biggie's murder, not Tupac's, because that was the Los Angeles murder. And in time, we kind of found ourselves in the middle of the Tupac murder investigation.
Right.
From the onset, they were cold cases. I came on way after the fact. I didn't start investigating until 2006, which was nearly 10 years after Tupac and 9 years after Biggie were murdered. So they were cold cases. And so we initially had to just try to absorb all of the investigative material that had been gathered for that period of time, getting familiar with it all, finding out what's been done, what hasn't been done, and then developing an investigative strategy to take a new approach at it because everything else had failed at that point.
Can you talk about what determines, I mean, there are endless cold cases at these major police departments, LAPD, NYPD, any big city has a ton of cold cases. What's sort of the logic that's applied to decide what cold cases are we going to look at again?
Well, the way it kind of works is a cold case, once it becomes cold, when you've already pursued all of the leads and all of the kind of conventional investigative methods, once you've exhausted all of that, you have to come up with something new and genuine. And sometimes it's a result of somebody calling in with new information, where you get a tip or a lead that you can then follow up on and hope that it leads to, making progress in the case. But other times it's like waiting to see if there's going to be a DNA hit eventually that'll connect a cold case to a recent DNA hit. And so they're all different. It can be a new witness coming forward. It can be forensics, developing something that you didn't previously have. Or it's just dogged police work where you just keep going out and constantly, reinvestigating people and trying to kick over every stone that has already been turned over.
As a homicide investigator, is it super clear to you when you've sort of hit the end, barring either new witnesses, new evidence, or some kind of forensics? Like from the outside, many times you see the public question when a police department says, we've reached the end and we don't really have anywhere else to go unless we get new evidence. And there's a lot of disagreement over, the police is handling it correctly or not. But as an actual person doing the investigation, is it pretty clear to you when you've gone as far as you can go with the evidence you have?
Yeah, you start to sense that that you're kind of running out of options. You're running out of leads. You're running out of information that will propel you forward, and it's frustrating. But there is a perception that because these cases aren't being solved, that the police aren't doing anything. And there's conventional investigative approaches. There's just things that all homicide detectives will have a process and have essentially check boxes. You interview people, you look at your physical evidence, you utilize whatever resources are available to you, and see what it gets you. But sometimes it just doesn't get you anywhere.
So when you started, I mean, when you actually started digging into this case, what allowed you to go beyond where it had been left about a decade prior?
Well, I had somewhat of an advantage because I had come from working in a kind of a broader federal context and working with much better resources than even the LAPD had at Robbery Homicide Division. And they're well equipped there, but they don't have all of the funding and the resources that they need to really undergo the investigative strategy that we developed for this case, we needed a lot of money and we needed a lot of reach to be able to travel and to buy narcotics and to do the things that aren't generally done in a standard homicide investigation. So, we kind of just took it to a new level and brought in a lot of resources that don't exist in a entity like robbery homicide division.
So ultimately, who do you believe killed Tupac Shakur?
Tupac Shakur was killed by a guy named Orlando Anderson. He was a Southside Crip from Compton. He was the same guy that Tupac Shakur had gotten into a fight with earlier that night at the MGM in the lobby. That individual, along with his crew of gang members, all searched out, found Tupac, and shot both him and Suge.
And ultimately, what's the evidentiary basis for that? In other words, I've seen you say that now we have factual proof of that. What is that proof?
That proof comes in the form of eyewitness testimony, not just eyewitness testimony, but comes in the form of co-conspirator testimony. The individual who shot and killed Tupac Shakur was in a car along with his uncle. His uncle's name was Keefe D. Dwayne Davis, also a Southside Crip gang member. And Dwayne Davis was compelled to cooperate during what we call a proffer session at the U.S. Attorney's Office. And he admitted to his involvement. He admitted to handing the gun to his nephew, who was in the back seat, who shot and killed Orlando. So we have an individual, a co-conspirator, confessing to the crime and explaining details that you wouldn't know about the crime unless you were actually there. So it was a very validated confession under very compelling circumstances, and it's the best evidence that there's ever been in a case.
Where is Orlando Anderson now?
Orlando Anderson was killed in 1998 outside of a gas station in Compton on an unrelated gang incident. He was trying to collect money, a drug debt from a couple of guys. Shooting took place, and Orlando Anderson ended up getting shot and killed.
You mentioned that these two investigations, that into Notorious B.I.G. and Tupac Shakur, that these investigations are linked. Can you talk about that a little bit? What is the connection?
Well, the connection is that Biggie Smalls was killed in retaliation for the shooting of Tupac Shakur in Las Vegas. There was an association between Bad Boy Records and these Southside Crips, the same ones who killed Tupac Shakur in Las Vegas. There was a business relationship and an alliance between Bad Boy Records and these Crips. And there was erroneous information that got out on the streets after Tupac was shot in Vegas. And that information was that Biggie Smalls had been in Vegas and Biggie Smalls had provided the gun to these Crips and that he had asked them to kill Tupac. That's all erroneous information. It was just street rumor, but it was very close to the truth because it was actually Biggie Smalls' godfather, a guy named Eric Martin Zip, who was the one that was in Vegas and handed the gun to the Crips and solicited them to kill Tupac.
Now, why would he do that? In other words, why would the godfather of Notorious B.I.G. be in a position where that's something that he would want to see happen, the killing of Tupac Shakur?
Right. So this individual, this Eric Martin, who is the godfather of Christopher Wallace, was a very, very close associate with Puffy Combs. And Zip was from Harlem. He had a background in New York as kind of a street hustler, and he was close with Puffy Combs. In fact, when Zip died, Puffy Combs spoke at his funeral. And there was a close relationship there. And Puffy Combs was the one who had actually previously had a conversation with Keefe D and said, hey, if you can take care of Biggie and if you can take care of Suge Knight and Tupac Shakur, he'd really appreciate it, because at that time there was so much friction going on between Bad Boy and Death Row, and specifically with Suge Knight and Puffy Combs. And Puffy Combs was aware that Suge Knight was out to kill him. And so he kind of did a preemptive strike by hiring these Crips to protect him. And at one particular incident, he tells the leader of the Crip, this guy who's in the car with the gun, listen, these guys are hunting me down. I can't afford to come to LA without worrying about being shot. Can you take care of that for me? That leads us to Las Vegas. And then the whole situation is fueled again by the fight that takes place between Tupac and this Crip gang member. And Zip, who has the gun, says, listen, let's kill two birds with one stone. They just jumped your nephew and beat him down. Plus Puffy wants this stuff taken care of, so let's go handle it.
Let me talk a little more broadly since we have you here. There are now pretty clear opposing views when it comes to how people should sort of carry on if police or someone like you comes and wants to talk to them. And there are those who say, listen, whether you might be involved or not in whatever the police want to talk to you about, there's really no benefit to talking because you might accidentally incriminate yourself. You might end up putting yourself in sort of a worse position. You're always better off not talking to police unless you're actually arrested and detained. And sort of, even in that case, you always want to have a lawyer present. The counterpoint often is, listen, if you're really not involved, by talking to the police, you are going to probably take away attention from you. That the act of not talking in and of itself might make someone like you, a homicide investigator, more focused on a potential witness or suspect. What's the truth about that in your eyes?
Well, it's actually both of those are true. You know, you have to evaluate what is a person's motive not to talk, especially when you would assume they would be interested in getting justice in the case, such as the cases with Tupac and Biggie. You would think that their friends and their entourage would be doing everything they could in order to try to bring the killers to justice. But unfortunately, in these kind of subcultures, whether it's gangs or, you know, street culture, they have a code not to cooperate with the police. And they take on the mentality of like, it's not my place to solve this homicide. It's not my place to throw somebody's name out there and put them on the radar of law enforcement. It's, you know, let the cops do their job, but they don't understand there's a needed dynamic where if we can't get witness information and witness cooperation, then we can't do our jobs. So it's a catch-22. I get the idea that you don't want to involve yourself in something so, you know, dangerous or delicate as a homicide investigation. But at the same time, if we want justice, we all have to, you know, to do our role. We all have to contribute everything that we can.
Yeah, I mean, I've never been in a situation where police have wanted to talk to me about anything, really anything, but certainly nothing as serious as a homicide. And I can sort of see it from both sides. On the one hand, if I did do something, I definitely would just say, I'm not talking to anybody unless I'm actually legally compelled to, and make them connect me to whatever crime we're investigating. If I didn't know a thing about it, knowing that police can lie to you during interrogations, knowing everything I know, I still think I might say, I don't, there's no benefit to me from going in there. And I guess the one argument that you're making would be, well, there might be some societal benefit to me saying I'm going to participate in the system, in the process here, but I guess to some risk to me, right?
Well, yeah, it's a little bit kind of hypocritical to say I expect the police to do their jobs and to get justice in these cases, but I won't do my part. I'm not going to cooperate and give them what they need in order to make progress in this case. So you have to decide what you want to do. Do you want to demand justice from the police while also not cooperate with information that will help the police get justice? Or do you say, hey, it's, you know, it's not the police's job if it's not my job. So we all are interdependent if we want the same thing, and that's justice.
Very, very interesting. We've been speaking with retired LAPD homicide detective Greg Kading. Greg, really appreciate you talking to me today.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Have a great day.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
All right, well, it happened. Adult film actress Stormy Daniels was interviewed for a while. I think it was about a half hour on CBS's 60 Minutes last night. We actually didn't really learn much of anything new. The highlights sort of were that right after she had spanked Trump with a rolled up magazine and I guess had a sexual encounter with him, Trump said gleefully that she reminds him of his daughter Ivanka. That continues to be really weird and creepy, but we already knew about that. She said she was not physically attracted to Trump, but that she was not a victim. This is not a Me Too moment. Everything that happened was consensual. She restated that she had been physically threatened over the affair. She gave the details. I believe this part was new, that she was in a Las Vegas garage on the way to a fitness class, and a guy came up to her. She was with her then infant daughter and said, forget about the Trump story. That's a nice little girl you have. Would be terrible if something happened to her mom. She was asked, do you have pictures or texts that are supporting corroborative evidence of this affair with Trump? She said, I've been advised by my attorney not to comment on that. And she also admitted, yeah, I previously did lie and say I didn't have an affair with Trump, but that was because I was scared about what would happen. And that last thing, which is, listen, if you lied before, how can we trust that now you're telling the truth? That came up. Anderson Cooper asked her about it during the 60 Minutes interview, and here's what she had to say.
How do we know you're telling the truth?
Because I have no reason to lie. I'm opening myself up for, possible danger and definitely a whole lot of
Yeah. So I don't know how much we learned, but it's good to continue to get this stuff on record. She is already being smeared by some on the right. There's a bunch of articles going around saying, did you notice how dilated Stormy Daniels' pupils were, even though she was in a really brightly lit room, which would have caused her pupils to contract rather than dilate? She was probably on something. She was probably lying. We just really can't believe anything. And people seem kind of split on the importance of this story. There's people who say this is a lame story. There's no reason to cover it. It's tabloid nonsense. And then there's other who say, no, this story is important. And there's a couple different reasons why people are saying the story is important. First is, if this is a pattern, and we already have other women saying, hey, I also had an affair with Trump, and I ended up either with hush money or a non-disclosure agreement, maybe with possible threats. We've not yet found out more about that. That would be notable for the president of the United States to have engaged in that. The more immediate concern is the legality of that $130,000 payment to Stormy Daniels and whether it was legal. Because question one is, okay, Michael Cohen, Trump's lawyer, says he paid Stormy $130,000 out of his own money. If that's true, that could count as an in-kind contribution to the campaign of Donald Trump of $130,000. You might know that the maximum you're allowed to contribute is $2,700. So that would be a problem. If Trump's lawyer, Michael Cohen, was paid back by Donald Trump for that money, then we have to look at where the payback money came from, because if it came out of Trump's campaign funds, that could possibly be an illegal use of campaign money, which, by the way, John Edwards got in trouble for. So there is precedent in terms of people being prosecuted for that. And lastly, there's the hypocrisy of Trump. And I know that at this point, Trump is so hypocritical on almost every issue. I don't know how much people care about this part of it, but Trump has been complaining for years and attacking Hillary on the basis of Bill Clinton's scandals and sexual impropriety. Now Trump has the exact same issues to deal with, which I guess we're disqualifying even for Hillary, even though they weren't her scandals. I don't expect that angle to be brought up really at any point, because it's so secondary or tertiary to everything else going on.
Well, I guess the difference there would be that this was a consensual relationship, where as what Bill Clinton was accused of was sexual misconduct that would have been illegal.
Some of those cases, not all.
Yep.
Some of those cases, not all.
So
but that is,
I think of it more as hypocrisy coming from the evangelicals on the right who thought of Trump as some holy person.
Yes, who I guess believed that his second favorite book was the Bible after the book that some other dude wrote and put Trump's name on. We'll see where this goes. I do think that this is a real story. I don't think that this is, when we've got the decimation of the EPA and just all this other stuff going on. Obviously, this is not the biggest story, but I think it is relevant, and it's important to keep a sort of tabs on, keep track of where the story is. There is a business story that's having major political implications, and tons of people are just misinterpreting the story, totally misunderstanding the story. And the story is that longtime gun manufacturer Remington has filed for bankruptcy. Remington has been around for a couple hundred years, since 1816. They're going to continue to be around. They make the Bushmaster AR-15 style rifle that a lot of people just love. That's the same type of rifle that was used in the Sandy Hook school shooting 6 years ago. Remington has been sued by family members of Sandy Hook victims. They've also had to deal with defective rifles, which we actually did an interview about with Arthur Bryant, Remington rifles that were spontaneously firing. Very, very scary stuff. But the confusions here are twofold. Number one is the confusion that Remington is in trouble financially because of anti-gun propaganda. And confusion number two is that Remington, in filing for bankruptcy, is going away. Remington's just not going to make guns anymore. Both are false, and I want to break each of these down. So first of all, Remington is going to stay in business. Yeah, they've been doing poorly as a business. They have about $700 million in debt. They are filing Chapter 11 bankruptcy, but this is a mechanism that lets them restructure their business and continue manufacturing and selling guns. This is sort of a financial transaction that they're involved in. It's not a going out of business thing where they're going to just give away all their AR-15s at a fraction of the retail cost. The other issue, and this is the more interesting one to me, is that some right-wingers, sort of the pro-gun fetishists, are looking at this news from Remington, of course, misunderstanding the reality of this bankruptcy filing and saying, look at this. The anti-gun left has been spreading their anti-gun propaganda, and now they have led to the downfall of just a true blue American institution in Remington. Think about how ridiculous that is. First of all, there were record gun sales under Barack Obama when Democrats actually had some influence over gun policy. We know that the thing that sells the most guns is the fear that someone's going to take the guns away. When President Obama was president, all you heard from the gun fetishists was Obama's going to take your guns. You saw the opposite. You saw record gun sales. And then on the other hand, under Trump, you've seen the entire industry of gun manufacturers and gun sales go down, right? It's not just Remington. It's that all of a sudden the NRA isn't saying the Democrat in the White House is going to take your guns. Alex Jones isn't saying the Democrat in the White House is going to take your guns. They're not scaring you with the possibility of a black Muslim Democrat from Indonesia or whatever the conspiracy theory was, who's going to take your guns. You don't feel as eager to go out and buy guns. But this is not something that's disproportionately impacting Remington. The entire gun industry is in trouble. Sturm Ruger, or is it Ruger? I never remember how to pronounce it. They've laid off hundreds of workers. Smith & Wesson has had terrible earnings. So this is a problem specifically for Remington only because their quality control has been troubled since they were taken over by a company called the Freedom Group, which is a name reminiscent of the Ministry of Peace in 1984 by George Orwell. It doesn't have to do with anti-gun propaganda. It doesn't have to do with anti-gun activism. If anything, what we've seen is that the anti-gun propaganda and the anti-gun activism actually helps sell more guns. So if only the pro-gun fetishists understood the story, you might see more reasonable comments from them. But I wouldn't be holding my breath that we're going to hear that from them anytime soon. We've got a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. We heard from the Eggman over the weekend, and he had really a pretty prescient point about Hillary Clinton and Russia murder stories, I guess is the way to say it. Let's take a listen to this.
Hey, Dave. When the conservative right thinks Hillary Clinton murdered somebody, like, theft raped or somebody, it's Hillary, she's a murderer.
Right.
But when the Russians, when Putin murders somebody, the conservative right says, that's a efficient and pragmatic way to run a government. Good job. I question that. Do you?
It's not even that. It's not that they just say, oh, Putin's just doing the right thing. A lot of them are just denying it, right? A lot of them are saying, no, there's no evidence for that. As if there's evidence for Hillary being involved in the murder of Seth Rich, right? There is a different standard that's applied here, for sure.
It's tribalism at its worst, to the point where it's acceptable for some people to kill others, whereas it's not acceptable for others to kill others.
Yeah, or just the amount of evidence we need before we say this person probably was involved in a murder is a drastically different standard of evidence than we would put in place for someone else. In this case, Hillary Clinton and Vladimir Putin's cronies, sort of respectively. We have a great bonus show for you today. The great thing about the bonus show is that it makes it so that when the regular daily show is over, there's still more show. Every single day, we produce a bonus program for our members and patrons. And I encourage you to sign up, become a member at davidpakman.com/membership. Use the 40% off coupon code if you want, which is VoteSoon18, or become a patron for as little as $1 a month. $5 a month gets you the bonus show at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Great bonus show for you today, and we'll speak to you then.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.